Margaret Ashby had learned in the 8 months of her marriage that a house could be full of people and still feel like a place where no one was waiting for you. She had learned it the way one learns most painful things, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small ones. The way conversation paused when she entered a room and resumed in a slightly different key. The way the housekeeper, Mrs. Holt, answered her questions with perfect correctness and not one syllable of warmth. The way her husband, Lord Arthur Pemberton, the Earl of Whitmore, looked through windows when she spoke to him, as though the glass held something more requiring of his attention than she did. She was not a foolish woman. She understood what she was. Her family had made certain of that before the engagement was even announced. Her uncle had called it an excellent arrangement. Her father had called it a great opportunity. Neither of them had used the word she had understood underneath both: necessary. The Ashby finances had needed the Pemberton name. The Pemberton estate had needed the Ashby money. And Margaret, the eldest daughter, the sensible one, the one who did not make difficulties, had walked to the altar at 23 with steady hands and a smile that had cost her more than anyone in that church had thought to ask about. She had not expected love. She was practical enough for that. But she had thought, in the quiet honesty of her own heart, that she might in time be seen. That she might become, if not cherished, then at least known. 8 months had revised that expectation considerably. She had known about Eleanor before she arrived. One does not enter a house of this size and history without learning its stories, and Eleanor Pemberton, Arthur's first wife, dead 3 years of a fever that had taken her between one winter and the next, was the kind of story a house tells in spite of itself, in the way the staff fell quiet at certain names, in the particular tenderness with which Mrs. Holt maintained the rooms that had been hers. In the portrait in the gallery, hung in the best light, facing the door, a woman in pale blue with dark eyes and an expression of quiet amusement, painted in the generous light of someone who had been loved while the work was done. Margaret had told herself it was grief, that Arthur's distance was the distance of a man still learning to live inside his loss, that 8 months was not very long, that patience was a form of love, or could become one, given time enough and care. It was an October evening when she understood she had been telling herself a story. Arthur had gone to the village on a matter of estate business, expected back by supper. Margaret had spent the afternoon in the library and had taken, on her way upstairs, a wrong corridor. The house was still not entirely familiar to her, its east wing longer than she had properly mapped, and had found herself approaching the portrait gallery from the far end rather than the near. She heard his voice before she reached the doorway. Low, unguarded, the voice he never used with her. She did not announce herself. She stood to the side of the open door and listened, with the particular stillness of a woman who has learned that stillness is the only way to hear the truth of things. He was standing before the portrait. His back was to the door. One hand rested on the frame, not heavily, but with the ease of a man touching something he had touched 10,000 times. "I have tried," he said, to the painted face that could not answer him. His voice held something she had not heard in it before. Not grief, exactly. Something older than grief. Something that had made its home in him long before she arrived. "God knows I have tried to be fair to her. She deserves that much." A pause. The fire shifted in the grate. "But she is not you, Eleanor." His voice dropped to almost nothing. She was never going to be. She is only a replacement, and she is too good a woman to deserve being one. Margaret did not move. She stood in the corridor of her own house, in the home that bore her husband's name and now her own, and she let the words settle into her the way cold settles into stone. Slowly, completely, with no particular cruelty and no particular mercy. Just the truth, arriving at last, in the voice of a man who had not thought to close the door. She walked back to her rooms the way she always walked through this house. Quietly, without hurrying, without allowing her face to become anything that a passing servant might later remember and repeat. She sat in the chair by the window. She folded her hands in her lap the way her mother had taught her, the way women of her upbringing were taught to hold themselves when holding themselves was the only thing left to do. She did not weep. She had grown over the course of 8 months, somewhat expert at not weeping. She thought instead, with the clear, cold precision that grief sometimes produces in practical women, about what she had actually known and what she had merely suspected and what she had refused, until this evening, to allow herself to name. He had not said, "I am still grieving." He had not said, "I find this difficult." He had said, "She is only a replacement." And the word only had done what small words do when they are precisely chosen. It had taken everything Margaret had quietly hoped and reduced it, with a single syllable, to the correct size. She rose before the fire had died entirely. She went to her writing desk. She did not write anything. She sat with her hands flat on the surface of it and looked at the wall and thought about her mother, who had died when Margaret was 11 and had left behind very little except a single instruction, delivered once in the garden and never repeated, that a woman who knows her own worth does not require anyone else to name it for her. Margaret had tried to believe this. She was still trying. The weeks that followed were the hardest kind. Not because anything changed, but because nothing did. Arthur was courteous at breakfast. He asked, with what appeared to be genuine inquiry, whether she had slept well, whether the morning suited her for riding, whether there was anything she required. He was not unkind. This was, she had begun to understand, the particular cruelty of the situation. If he had been unkind, she would have had something to push against. Instead, he was careful, measured. He treated her with the precise consideration one extends to a guest who has been placed in an awkward position through no fault of their own, and for whose comfort one feels a quiet, impersonal responsibility. She was the awkward guest. She had lived in this house for 8 months, and she was still, to him, a guest. The county called, as the county does, in rotation and with the sustained interest of people who have been observing the same families for generations and find the introduction of a new countess worth examining. Lady Fenmore admired the drawing room with the calibrated warmth of a woman who had admired Eleanor's drawing room for 15 years, and was performing the transfer of that admiration to the new arrangement with visible effort. Sir Henry Dowell addressed Margaret 3 times, each time as my lady, with the slight upward inflection of a man who was still adjusting to the title belonging to a different face. She received them all. She poured tea with steady hands. She asked the right questions and offered the right remarks, and smiled in the way she had perfected, which was warm enough to satisfy and contained enough to reveal nothing. She was, by any observable measure, doing beautifully. Inside the drawing room at Whitmore Hall, only Mrs. Holt had been watching long enough and closely enough to see the difference between doing beautifully and being well. The housekeeper said nothing about this, but Margaret noticed one Thursday evening that a small vase of late autumn roses had appeared on the writing desk in her sitting room. She had not asked for them. She did not remark upon them. She sat with them that evening and felt for the first time in several weeks that she was not entirely invisible to everyone in the house. She held this carefully, the way one holds small things when they are all one has. The letter from her sister arrived in the 2nd week of November. Clara was 20, unmarried, and had been Margaret's primary correspondent since childhood. The one person who wrote without performing, who said the unsayable in her quick, uneven hand, without appearing to notice that it was unsayable. Her letter was 3 pages of news from Bath, their aunt's opinions, their father's new hunting dog, and then, near the end, a single paragraph that Margaret read 4 times. I hope, Clara had written, that Whitmore is everything it should be. I hope he is kind to you. I hope, Meg, and I am saying this because there is no one else who will, that you are not simply enduring it. You were never supposed to simply endure things. You were supposed to be happy. I have not forgotten that, even if everyone else has. Margaret folded the letter. She placed her hand flat on the drawer she had set it in. She sat with Clara's words and her mother's instruction, and the roses on the writing desk, and the particular silence of a house that had not yet learned to make room for her, and she understood that she had a choice that she had been postponing. She could continue to wait to be seen, or she could begin quietly and without announcement to make herself impossible to overlook. She began with the household accounts. It was entirely within her remit. The management of the household had been transferred to her at the wedding in the formal way of these things, though in practice Mrs. Holt had continued as before and Margaret had not yet asserted otherwise. She requested the full account records the following Monday morning. Mrs. Holt brought them without comment, with the professional neutrality of a woman reserving judgment. Margaret spent 3 days with the ledgers. She was thorough. She found several areas of unnecessary expenditure and 2 of genuine mismanagement, neither of them Mrs. Holt's fault. They predated her tenure and had simply never been corrected. She also found at the bottom of the document case a ledger she had not requested. Bound in dark green, older than the rest, placed there with the careful deliberateness of something that could not be put elsewhere and could not be put away. She would have left it unopened. But it was Arthur's estate record. She recognized the year on the spine as the year of his first marriage, and she was now the Countess of Whitmore, with the full remit of this house's management, and she had decided 3 days ago to begin conducting herself accordingly. She opened it. It was not a simple account ledger. It was a working record of the estate, tenant decisions, maintenance notes, correspondence summaries, written in 2 hands. Arthur's angular script and another, smaller, rounder, written with the quick confidence of someone entirely at home on the page. Decisions discussed in the margins, disagreements noted and resolved. A running conversation between 2 people who had been managing something together, as equals, for years. She turned the pages slowly. At the back, folded between the final leaf and the cover, was a letter, addressed in Arthur's handwriting, dated 6 weeks before his marriage to Margaret. She recognized the name on the front, Thomas, his brother, whom she had met once at the wedding, and who had looked at her with the expression of a man withholding something out of kindness. She read it. It was mostly practical, estate matters, an investment decision, the tenancies. And then, in the slightly changed quality of handwriting that meant a man had stopped and started again. This, I will be honest with you, because there is no one else to be honest with. I am doing what needs to be done. The Ashby girl is sensible and good, and I have no right to ask more of myself than fairness, or more of her than she has already given. But Thomas, I am terrified. Not that I will be cold to her. I will not allow myself to be cold to her, but that I will look at her for the rest of my life and see only the proof of Eleanor's absence. That I will be standing in my own house and still be a man whose house is empty. I do not know how to make myself a fair husband to someone who had the misfortune of arriving after. I do not know how to look at her properly. I am afraid that if I begin to look, she will see what I am doing to her. And I cannot bear to cause her pain with my own grief when she has already given up so much to be here. Margaret sat for a long time after she had finished reading. She understood now the full architecture of what she had been living inside. Not a man who did not care. A man so afraid of failing her that he had never permitted himself to come close enough to try. A man who had looked at her across 8 months of careful breakfast conversation and had seen, in every exchange, the evidence of his own inadequacy. Who had called her a replacement not with contempt, but with the guilt of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, and could not stop, and was confessing it to a portrait because he had not been able to say it to her face. She had been living inside his grief. He had been living inside his guilt. And neither of them had found a way to say so. She refolded the letter. She returned it precisely as she had found it. She closed the ledger. And then she sat for one more moment in the quiet of the household office, with her hands flat on the desk, and thought about her mother's instruction, and Clara's letter, and the roses, and the 8 months of steady hands and perfected smiles, and she made the second decision. She went to find her husband. He was in the study. The door was open. He was at his desk with a document in his hand, not reading it. His gaze had settled somewhere to the left of the page, with the look she now understood was not indifference. It was the look of a man who was very often somewhere inside his own guilt, and was doing his best to find his way back. She walked in without waiting in the corridor. He looked up. Something moved in his expression at the sight of her. Something she recognized, because she had been feeling it herself for 8 months. Something cautious and hoping at once. "Margaret," he said. "I have been reviewing the household accounts," she said. "I found the green ledger in the document case, the estate record from your first marriage." He was very still. "And the letter inside it," she said, "to Thomas, the one you did not send." The document in his hand lowered to the desk. "I read it," she said. "I am not going to apologize for that. It concerned me, and I am the Countess of Whitmore, and I have spent 8 months in this house without being told the things that concerned me." He said nothing. His expression was the one she had been waiting 8 months to see. Not the careful breakfast face, not the polished courtesy of a man performing fairness. Just him, without management, caught. "You said she is only a replacement," Margaret said. "In the gallery. In October. I was in the corridor. I had taken the wrong turning, and I heard you before I could make myself known." She paused. "I want you to understand that I have been carrying that since October. That I have sat across from you at breakfast every morning since October. And I have managed this household, and received the county, and conducted myself as your countess while carrying those words. And I am telling you this not to wound you, but because I am finished carrying things alone in this house." He closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were the eyes of a man who has been found carrying something in the dark. "I know you heard me," he said. "I have known since the following morning. You were composed in a way that was different. I could not account for it at the time. I have been accounting for it since." His voice was not the voice of careful breakfasts. It was rougher and quieter and entirely undefended. I told myself that if you had heard, you would have said something, and then I understood that you would not say something. Because you are not a woman who speaks before she has decided what she wants to do with the truth. A pause. I have been ashamed every day since October that I did not come to you first. You should have, she said, simply, without anger. Yes, he said, I should have. He rose from the desk. He did not cross the room to her. He stood midway, the distance between them measured and honest, and he looked at her with the full attention she had been waiting 8 months to receive. I was afraid, he said, that if I looked at you properly, you would see exactly what I had made of your life here. You were so composed, so relentlessly, quietly composed, and I told myself it was your nature, that you were content. Because the alternative, he stopped. The alternative was looking directly at what I had done. I am not composed by nature, Margaret said. I am composed by practice. There is a difference. I have been practicing for 8 months because it was the only thing this house seemed to want from me. She held his gaze. I am not content. I have not been content. I have been enduring, which is a thing my sister told me in a letter I have read 4 times that I was never supposed to do. Something broke in his expression. Not loudly. The way ice breaks at the end of a long winter. At the place where the pressure has always been greatest, quietly, and then without stopping. He crossed the remaining distance. He did not reach for her hand. He simply stood close enough that the careful space they had maintained across 8 months of breakfast tables and corridor silences was no longer between them. And he looked at her, not through her, not past her, at her. At the woman who had walked to his altar with steady hands and a smile that had cost her considerably, and who had asked for nothing except to be, in time, known. I have looked at you poorly, he said, from the very beginning, and you have conducted yourself in this house with more grace than I had any right to expect and more patience than I deserved. He paused. I cannot make 8 months right in a single conversation. I am not going to tell you that I can. But I am asking if you will allow it to begin looking at you properly, now, from tonight. Whatever that requires. Margaret considered him. She considered a man who had stood before a portrait and spoken his grief to a painting because he could not bear to speak it to her face. Who had written a letter he could not send about a fear he could not name. Who was standing now in his own study having said the truest thing he had said to her since the day they met, and who was waiting, with the stillness of a man who understands he has no right to expect anything for her to decide. You should know, she said, that I am not a quiet woman by nature. I have opinions about the South Pasture investment and the Eastern tenant cottages and several other things I have observed in 8 months of being present in a house that did not always notice I was present. She looked at him steadily. If you are asking me to be truly here, that is what it will look like. He was still. And then the expression she had not seen in 8 months moved across his face. Not relief, or not only that. Something closer to recognition. The look of a man who has been searching for something without knowing the shape of it, and has found it standing directly in front of him, where it has been for 8 months, waiting for him to simply turn and see. Tell me about the South Pasture, he said, and she did. They talked until the study grew dark, and the lamps were brought, and neither of them noticed. She told him about the South Pasture and the Eastern cottages, and the 2 ledger errors that predated Mrs. Holt, and 3 other things she had been observing and setting aside. He listened with the complete attention she had watched him give to everything except her, and she understood now that this was simply how he was when he was genuinely present. Entirely, without remainder. He told her in return about Eleanor. Not the grief of it, not the shape of the loss, but the shape of her. The way she had argued with him about the 1811 harvest decision and been right. The way she had managed the household not as a courtesy extended to her, but as a thing she had claimed and made her own. The way she had died between one winter and the next, and left behind a silence that he had not known how to fill, and had eventually, wrongly, decided to leave empty. I did not tell you any of this, he said, because I did not know how to begin. I did not ask, she said, because I did not know whether I was allowed to. He looked at her. You are allowed. You have been allowed since the day you arrived. I simply never said so. And not saying so was its own kind of failure. She considered this, not quickly. She considered it the way she considered every true thing, with patience, without performance. Then say so now, she said. You are allowed, he said. Everything in this house is yours to understand and to question and to know. I should have made that plain at the beginning. A pause. I should have made many things plain at the beginning. Margaret nodded. She did not offer him immediate forgiveness, because she did not think it would serve either of them. What she offered was more honest, the expression of a woman who has heard a true thing and is in the process of deciding what to do with it, and who has not yet decided fully, and who is not going to pretend otherwise. "It will take time," she said, "for me to believe it. I know," he said. "I am not asking you to believe it tonight." She rose. The lamps were lit, and the November night had settled against the windows, and it was late. She was at the door when she stopped and turned. He was still at the desk, watching her with an expression she was only beginning to learn the name for. "Arthur," she said. She had not used his name before, not plainly, not like that. He stilled at the sound of it. "The portrait. I do not want it moved. She was here before me. She loved this house. She has a right to be in it." She held his gaze. "But when you go to the gallery, I would rather you did not go alone." A long moment passed. "Yes," he said. "I would like that." She went to her rooms. She sat at the writing desk. The roses Mrs. Holt had left were still open, 3 of them on the corner of the desk. She looked at them for a while. She thought about the letter she would write to Clara in the morning, the one that would say, "I think I am beginning to be seen. I think it is going to take time, and I think I am prepared for that, and I think, Clara, that this is something other than enduring. I think this is something else entirely." She did not write it yet. She sat with the November silence and the quiet house and let the evening settle. And she noticed, in the way one notices things when one is finally paying attention to the right things, that the house sounded different tonight. Not warmer, not yet, but less empty, as though something that had been held carefully apart from her had shifted, by the smallest degree, in her direction. She thought that was enough for a beginning. She had always been a woman who knew how to begin. They went to the gallery together on a Sunday morning in December. The winter light came through the tall windows at the slow, unhurried angle of a season, with nothing to prove. They stood before Eleanor's portrait side by side, and Arthur did not speak for a long time, and Margaret did not ask him to. When he did speak, it was not to the portrait, it was to her. "She would have liked you," he said. She had very little patience for performance. She liked people who were entirely present. A pause. "You are one of the most present people I have ever failed to notice." Margaret looked at the dark eyes and the quiet amusement, and thought that it was not the amusement of a woman being painted, but of a woman who had found life consistently more interesting than most people gave it credit for. "She looks as though she argued with you regularly," Margaret said. "Constantly," Arthur said. "And was generally right." "I am also generally right," Margaret said. He turned to look at her. The December light fell across her face, and he looked at her with the full unguarded attention of a man who has decided, at last, to see. "Yes," he said quietly. "I am beginning to understand that." Outside the gallery window, the Whitmore estate lay still and frost-white under the winter sky. The tenant farms, the south pasture, the long avenue of bare elms leading to the gate. The house that had been a great house long before either of them arrived, and would remain one long after. The house that had been full of people, and had still, for 8 months, felt like a place where no one was waiting. Margaret Pemberton, Countess of Whitmore, stood in the portrait gallery beside her husband, and felt, for the first time since she had walked to his altar with steady hands, that someone was waiting. It was not the end of the difficulty. There were months ahead in which things would need to be said that had not yet been said, and a marriage built properly from the materials they actually had, rather than the ones they had each been pretending to have. But Margaret had always been good at beginnings. She had simply, until now, been given so little to begin with. She turned from the portrait. She walked beside Arthur out of the gallery and into the long corridor, where the morning light lay across the floor in pale winter bars, and the house was quiet around them, with the particular quiet of a place in which something has shifted and taken up a new position. She did not look back at the portrait. She did not need to. Eleanor was part of this house, and this house was now hers, and the two facts were not in contest with each other. They were simply both true. She had learned in the 8 months of her marriage that a house could be full of people and still feel like a place where no one was waiting. She was learning now that the same house with the same people could become something else entirely. If one person found the courage to stop managing their grief, and another found the courage to stop enduring in silence, and both of them found, in the same quiet November evening, that honesty was not the thing they had been afraid of. It was the thing they had both been waiting for. If this story found you today, if you have ever been the one who waited quietly, who held themselves together beautifully while something inside them was asking only to be seen, then you already understand what Margaret understood. That being known is not something you are given. It is something you eventually, gently, refuse to live without. We would love to know where in the world you are watching from. Leave us your city, your country, the corner of the earth where this story reached you. And if it moved you, please share it with someone who might need it today. These stories travel only as far as the people who carry them. Help this one find the person it was meant for.